Buckle up and hold on to your kilts, because today we're going on a journey into one of the most perplexing and mystifying cases in Canadian history. On a quiet summer's day in 1989, the residents of Richmond, Vancouver were left stunned when the lifeless body of Cindy James, a 44-year-old nurse, was found, hogtied and strangled to death in the garden of an abandoned house. What makes this case so utterly perplexing is the fact that despite years of torment by an invisible stalker, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police concluded that Cindy had taken her own life. But the question remains, did Cindy really do this to herself? Or was she silenced by someone determined to keep their secrets hidden? Today, we'll take a wee look into the mystery surrounding the death of Cindy James and uncover the shocking truths that have remained hidden for decades. Get ready for a mind-blowing ride, folks. Let's go. Cindy's past was shrouded in mystery, marked by a childhood of solitude due to her father's military job, which led to frequent relocations that prevented her from forming meaningful connections. Despite her strict upbringing though, and domestic responsibilities, Cindy cherished her family time, but she yearned for the freedom to explore the world and make her own path. At the age of 18, Cindy made a bold decision to embark on a journey of independence by moving to Vancouver, a city where she had no family and no friends. Despite the daunting prospect though, Cindy was resolute in her pursuit of her new life. It was in Vancouver that she began training as a nurse, and it was during this time that she met Roy Makepeace. He was a 39-year-old psychiatrist who was one of her tutors. Roy was already married, but that didn't stop him from having a wee fancy for the younger, much hotter Cindy. They kept the relationship under wraps, on the down low. 40-year-old married man keeping his 18-year-old girlfriend a secret. Pfft, you know it, lads. But in 1966, Roy divorced his wife and married Cindy. Cindy couldn't wait to share the news of her marriage with her parents, but when they found out, they were less than pleased. They were annoyed because, they were completely unaware that Cindy was even engaged. They wrote a really nasty wee letter to Roy, accusing him of taking advantage of the naive young daughter. But here's the first twist. Cindy had written that letter herself. Yikes. Despite this red flag, Roy forgave Cindy and moved on. Nothing at all to do with her aforementioned hotness and age, of course. It was love. But as time passed, Cindy's behaviour became increasingly erratic and confusing, suggesting that she may have had a personality disorder. She would often lash out at Roy for no apparent reason, and even told her friends that he was physically abusive, an allegation that Roy obviously denied. By mid-1982, Cindy had reached a breaking point in her marriage with Roy, and she decided to leave him. Cindy moved into her own apartment and tried to move on from her failed marriage. However, her separation from Roy would soon become the least of her worries. 4 months later, in October, Cindy began receiving threatening phone calls, which marked the beginning of a terrifying ordeal that would ultimately lead to her mysterious death. Cindy had recently moved into a new apartment by herself, so receiving even one threatening phone call would have been unnerving enough. However, this anonymous caller didn't stop at just one call. They relentlessly hounded her, sometimes even in the middle of the night, making terrifying threats, or simply just breathing heavily into the receiver without even speaking a word. After a few days of this, Cindy began to feel like she was being watched. Once, when the feeling became too much to bear, she closed the curtains in her living room. Immediately the phone rang, and the same ominous voice on the other end said,
"Don't think pulling the drapes means I don't know you're in there."
The caller always addressed Cindy by name, indicating that they knew who she was, even if she didn't know them. Cindy immediately called the authorities to report the harassment that she was experiencing. Investigators arrived at her apartment, but unfortunately, they had no leads or evidence to work with. All they could do was advise Cindy to be careful and to keep a diary of any future incidents. Just 3 days later, Cindy and her new friend Agnes Woodcock went out for dinner together. When they returned to Cindy's apartment, they discovered that the front door was wide open. One of the windows had been shattered and all of the pillows on Cindy's bed had been slashed. To add to this horror, the intruder had left the front door key on the bedside table. As the weeks passed, Cindy's situation became increasingly alarming. She reported even more disturbing incidents, including hearing someone creeping around outside her home at night, having her porch lights smashed and her phone lines cut. Notes made from magazine clippings were left on her doorstep, and dead cats were strung up in her backyard with threatening notes attached, which read,
"You're next."
Packages of raw meat were delivered to her address, and she even found her dog, Heidi, shaking with fear with a cord tightly tied around her neck, indicating that someone had attempted to strangle the dog. Cindy had reached a grim conclusion. This mysterious figure was hell-bent on driving her to an early grave. Every eerie encounter was reported to the authorities, but the invisible stalker never left a shred of evidence. No fingerprints, no DNA, not even a faint whiff of their presence. As the weeks wore on, the police began to question Cindy's credibility. Was she truly being stalked by this shadowy figure, or was she merely fabricating these harrowing events for attention? Look, it's understandable why the police were sceptical, given that the incidents always occurred when they weren't monitoring Cindy's house. The phone calls only seemed to come when the authorities weren't tapping her phone. But who's to say that her stalker wasn't keeping a close eye on their every move as well? One of the detectives assigned to this case, Pat McBride, went above and beyond his duty to ensure Cindy's safety. He offered to move into her spare room to keep a watch over her. Cindy, of course, accepted this offer, and as you might expect, the relationship took a wee romantic turn. With a cop now living in the house, Cindy's tormentor would surely leave her alone, right? Well, unfortunately not. The perpetrator continued to tamper with her phone, and the on-again, off-again nature of Cindy and Pat's relationship meant that he wasn't always there to protect her. Pat would eventually propose to Cindy. She would turn him down and ask him to move out, though they did remain good friends. Just a month after this incident with the slashed pillows, the authorities spotted Cindy's ex-husband Roy parked behind her house. After speaking to him, he insisted that he was there with nothing but good intentions. He was aware of what was going on with Cindy and was determined, as she was, to put an end to it all. He was hoping to catch a glimpse of this would-be stalker. He was ultimately just sent on his way by the police. One night in January of 1983, Agnes paid a visit to Cindy's house, only to find her crouched outside with a nylon stocking tightly wrapped around her neck. Agnes helped her to remove the stocking, and a shaken Cindy recounted that while she was walking to the garage, someone had snuck up behind her and strangled her with the stocking. She couldn't identify the assailants, having only caught a glimpse of their white sneakers. Enough was enough, so Cindy upped and moved house. She got her car sprayed a completely different colour and even changed her last name. Her plan worked. Peace at last. Cindy wouldn't be bothered anymore by her stalker. She was able to finally be rid of this menace that was tormenting her life. She even took a wee vacation. She was finally free. Well, that would be a nice ending to that story, right? Unfortunately, that was far from the truth. As Cindy returned from her vacation, hoping for some peace of mind, she found herself once again confronted by her elusive stalker. A handmade note with just 2 words.
"Welcome back."
Frustrated with the lack of progress in the police investigation and feeling like she wasn't being taken seriously, Cindy decided to take matters into her own hands. She sought the help of a well-respected private investigator called Ozzy Caban, who immediately recognised the severity of the situation. To ensure Cindy's safety, Ozzy provided her with a 2-way radio to use when her phone lines were cut, as well as a panic button in her home for emergencies. Despite his efforts, even Ozzy began to have doubts about Cindy's story. His doubts about Cindy's credibility, though, were put to rest one night in 1984 when he heard disturbing sounds coming from the 2-way radio. It sounded like she was in the middle of a struggle with someone. Without hesitation, Ozzy rushed to her home, where he found Cindy lying in the hallway with a sharp blade impaled right through her hand. It was pinning her to the floor. The attacker had left a note that read,
"Now you must die."
Although Cindy's pulse was weak, she was still alive. When she regained consciousness, she told detectives everything that she could remember about the attack. As the needle pierced her skin, Cindy felt a cold rush of fear wash over her. The world around her blurred and twisted until everything went black. The officers scoffed at her, tired of her so-called imaginary drama. They didn't even bother to take fingerprints and just dismissed her claims as lies. But Cindy knew the truth, and now so did Ozzy Caban. Ozzy was fully convinced of her story now, certain that there were no way that she could have done all this to herself. Cindy's family agreed, believing that her stalker was a master manipulator who knew exactly when to strike and how to keep his distance. Whoever this was, they wanted the cops to think that Cindy was losing her mind, to push her to the brink of insanity. Well, I guess the plan worked. With everything that was going on and Cindy's anxiety through the roof, she committed herself to Lionsgate Psychiatric Hospital, where she stayed there for 5 days. After she felt better, and the doctors agreed, she was out and back home. Cindy chose to move house yet again, this time to Richmond, Vancouver. However, things would only get worse for Cindy. On the 5th of December 1985, Cindy was found in a catatonic state. This time, however, she was 6 miles from her home in a roadside ditch. The scene was strange to say the least. She was wearing men's work boots and rubber gloves, and not much else. Her body was covered in numerous bruises, and she was suffering from hypothermia. The telltale sign of the stalker was still present, as a pair of pantyhose were wrapped tightly around her throat. She was unable to recall any details about her location or how she had ended up there. It was a relief when Cindy's friend Agnes and her husband Tom began spending the night at Cindy's house, allowing her to finally get some much needed rest free from worry. For a while, things seemed to settle down, but in April of 1986 they flared up again, this time in an even more terrifying way. Agnes and Tom were staying at Cindy's house when they were suddenly awakened by the sound of fire in the downstairs rec room. They discovered that the phone lines had been cut yet again, the panic button had been disabled, and they were trapped. They were able to get outside to seek help, only to find a man standing outside. They called to him, begging for him to call the fire brigade, but he simply just ran off, leaving them alone to deal with the blaze. There were no signs of forced entry, which led the police to believe that the fire originated from within the house, most likely by Cindy herself. However, her friends Tom and Agnes argued that this was impossible, because Cindy would never have put their lives in danger. In May of that year, Cindy reached her breaking point and announced that she was going to take her own life, as it seemed to be the only way to escape the relentlessness and threats, traumatic flashbacks and nightmares that had plagued her all this time. Consequently, she was hospitalised again. She was put under close supervision. During this time, she was diagnosed with multiple disorders, including paranoia, schizophrenia and psychopathy. In October, Cindy's ex-husband Roy Makepeace was the recipient of a troubling phone call. 2 weeks following him getting this ominous message, Cindy was discovered in a comatose state in the back seat of her own car, with her limbs tightly bound behind her back and her mouth covered with electrical tape. She had no recollection of the events leading up to this discovery. Cindy later revealed to her sister that she believed her mental capacity had been compromised due to lack of oxygen with the electrical tape being over her mouth. An expert in knots stated that it would have been impossible for her to have bound herself in such a manner. After becoming weary of Cindy's persistent inquiries, the police neglected to investigate the previous incident any further. For the following 3 years, they paid little to no attention to Cindy's claims and reports. However, on May 25th, 1989, Cindy vanished without a trace. Agnes visited her home that evening, but she was unable to locate her, despite having arranged a meeting with her previously. This was unusual and concerning. Shortly after Cindy's disappearance, her vehicle was discovered in a shopping mall parking lot. Inside the car were newly purchased groceries, a wrapped gift for her friend's child, and a recent bank deposit receipt. Bloodstains were found on the exterior of the driver's side door, and items from Cindy's wallet were discovered just beneath the vehicle, indicating that a struggle had certainly taken place. Despite an extensive search, no trace of Cindy was found. That was until 2 weeks later. On the 8th of June 1989, a paving contractor called Gordon Starchuk was working in Blundell Road in Richmond. That afternoon, he would make a chilling discovery. In the backyard of an abandoned house, he would stumble across the body of a woman. It was Cindy. She was found in the fetal position, with her body hog-tied by rope and a nylon stocking tightly wrapped around her neck. Her coat was discovered near her body. The location where she was found was situated by a busy intersection with high pedestrian traffic. Law enforcement discovered a disturbing message in orange spray paint on the exterior fuel tank of the residence, which read, "Some bitch died here." A line of orange paint encircled the victim's body, leading from the fuel tank to her location. Inside the abandoned home, authorities found another graffiti, which simply read, "Devil." Despite being deceased for 2 weeks, it was not strangulation that caused her death. Instead, her heart stopped due to a combination of substances injected into her system, as evidenced by a needle mark on her right arm. There were no signs of any tools or objects at the scene to indicate that she administered this injection herself. Unbelievably still, the investigators concluded that she either deliberately took her own life or unintentionally did so whilst carrying out one of her staged attacks, which obviously makes zero sense. Upon examining Cindy's body at the scene, pathologist Sheila Carlisle observed that her hands were bound so tightly that one finger had scraped the other one down to the bone. Additionally, a small puncture wound consistent with a hypodermic needle was discovered on the inner right elbow of her body. By analysing the insect and larva activity on the remains, forensic entomologist Gail Anderson determined that the body had started to decompose on the spot where it was discovered as early as June 2nd. The pathologist certainly didn't agree with the detective's conclusions that Cindy had done this to herself. Well, at least someone has a bit of sense. So let's look at it from a murder perspective, shall we? It's highly unlikely that Cindy would have tied herself up and administered a fatal dose of morphine, making the murder hypothesis just all that more plausible. This theory is further supported by Cindy's friends, family and Ozzy Caban, who believe that her body could not have gone unnoticed for 2 whole weeks, as the location was visible from the roadside. Therefore, someone must have dumped her there after taking her life. The lack of any implements at the scene also suggested that someone other than Cindy had injected her. Given that Cindy knew the perpetrator, the main suspects are her ex-husband, Roy Makepeace, and her ex-boyfriend, police officer Pat McBride. Roy certainly had a motive for harming Cindy, as she had left him, and it was no secret that he really wanted her back. The fact that all the torment started just a few months after their separation is suspicious. And remember, he was also caught parked outside her house without her knowledge, which is definitely worth noting. As a doctor, Roy would have access to substances that were often used to sedate Cindy, such as morphine and flurazepam. His psychiatric knowledge would also have enabled him to manipulate both Cindy and the investigators. Conversely, it's possible that Detective Pat McBride made all of the threatening calls to Cindy as a way to get close to her, given that he was infatuated with her. By ensuring that he was assigned to the case after she called local authorities for help, he could have planned to offer to stay with her, knowing that she was in a vulnerable position. Even after Cindy turned down his proposal and broke up with him, Pat may well have still been infatuated with her. As a policeman, he would have known how to hide all the evidence of his activities, how to stage scenes in a certain way to influence the detectives, and make them think that Cindy was crazy. He also would have known when the cops were surveilling Cindy's house and the phone, and therefore he would have known when to strike. Alternatively, it's possible that an unknown person had developed an unhealthy fixation with Cindy and was leaving these disturbing messages, although there is another possibility to consider. Let's re-examine the recording and carefully listen to the voice. Does it sound like a male voice to you? To me, it sounds more like a woman attempting to disguise her voice as a man. This leads us to another possibility, that Cindy was the invisible stalker all along. Maybe she had been reporting staged incidents to the authorities for 7 years, risking her own safety numerous times to convince them that she was being tormented. Then, either intentionally or unintentionally, she orchestrated an intricate and perplexing conclusion to this situation. This idea may seem plausible, Because it is difficult to believe that this invisible stalker made no errors and failed to leave any incriminating evidence throughout the entire 7-year ordeal. It's possible that Cindy was the stalker all along, and perhaps even more unsettling, she may not even have been aware of it. One potential explanation is that Cindy had dissociative identity disorder and developed a split personality. During her dissociative episodes, she may have sincerely believed that someone was tormenting her, without realising that she was, in fact, her own stalker. Cindy's mental state was undoubtedly fragile, but it's unclear whether her psychological decline was because of an inevitable condition from the stress and anxiety of being harassed by a genuine stalker. 30 years have passed since these harrowing events that unfolded in Vancouver, yet the mystery remains unsolved, and the question still lingers. Is a killer walking free? The uncertainty gnaws at your soul, leaving us with only one haunting thought. What is more chilling? The idea that someone inflicted this on poor Cindy, or the notion that she inflicted all of this on herself without even realising it? Thanks ever so much for taking the time to watch this video. I love making content for you guys, and who knows, maybe one day I'll be able to do this thing full time. So, if you haven't already subscribed, please consider doing so. It's totally free, and it only takes a second, and it means you won't miss any of my upcoming videos. I genuinely wish you all the very best. Please stay safe out there, tell someone you love them, and no matter what, always keep smiling.